this is the first of two religious language coveralls and PowerPoints then. This one is going to be specific. This one is going to be specifically, hey Kenzie, specifically on via negativa, analogical language and symbol. So each of the sections has a line to show the different ones. So the top 3 sets of boxes are going to be for via negativa. This is known as the apophatic way. So if you want to do a highlighter just down the edge so that you recognise it's the apophatic way in via negativa, you can if you wish. But this is going to be the next few boxes. So the apophatic way goes in the top first box. It might be called the apophatic way in your exam. It might be called via negativa. It's the same thing. The apophatic way involves speaking of God in negative terms, emphasising the difference between God and humanity. So God is immortal, God is invisible, God is inaccessible, God is timeless. Now, whilst this isn't negative, so using a not, for example, it implies it. So God is not in time. But rather than saying God is not in time, you just call him timeless. God is not visible. You just call him invisible. So that's why, whilst they're not negative language, they still imply a negative. Those that follow via negativa argue that these statements are of fact. These are factual statements. When you say God is immortal or God is invisible, these are statements of facts. Any descriptions that give God positive attributes are misleading. So to talk of God as king or shepherd implies God as a body, or God is male because king is male, implies a job description, so shepherd, someone that herds sheep. So all of this language where you describe God in positive terms is misleading. Last couple of points to that first top box. Even saying God is love makes people think of human love, which is limited. Human love can be corrupted, misused, terminated. And so this idea that you're talking of God is love, you also think of it in human terms and human sense. And so what, not Boethius, wrong person, what Dionysius is going to argue, Pseudo-Dionysius is going to argue, is that it's better to accept the mysteries of God than try to pin God down using flawed concepts. So it's better to accept God as a mystery than trying to use language and words to describe God, to pin God down, that therefore become misleading or flawed. Negative language, facts. Anything else, any positive language, leaders or misleading. So any positive language is misleading. You then have 2 boxes underneath. These are both going to be for Pseudo-Dionysius. So both the boxes underneath, you're going to have one slide in one slide in the other. So the first of your 2 boxes underneath. Pseudo-Dionysius. First of all, why was he called pseudo? It is because at the time when Dionysius was writing, they thought he was the Dionysius. And then when he died and they started to look at the things he'd written and the dates, it didn't correlate with the Dionysius. And so they didn't actually know who he was. And so this anonymous thinker that was known as Dionysius actually wasn't. And so they started to call him Pseudo-Dionysius. Pseudo meaning fake or not the original. You don't have to go into that in your exam. It's just so you know why you're calling him Pseudo-Dionysius and not just Dionysius. We do know, however, that he was a mystic, a Christian who spent a lot of time in deep contemplation about his experiences with God and whose writings influenced the work of many medieval Christians. He argued that via negativa is the only way to speak truthfully about God, because God is beyond all understanding and imagination. So that's what goes in that first of the 2 boxes. So via negativa is the only way to speak truthfully, because God is beyond our understanding and beyond our imagination. So you can only talk about God in the negative terms as how he's different from our experience. Excellent. Box to the side is then for Dionysius continued. He wrote about the need of the soul to become unified with God. This links nicely with religious experience ideas, this idea of the soul becoming unified or one with God, and how the physical body and spiritual soul are divided, so a dualist perspective. The soul's quest for God being held back by the body, very much a Platonic idea or influenced by Plato. He argued that it is counterproductive to speak of God as though God can be seen by senses or reached through reason. Instead, you must go beyond these, entering a cloud of unknowing for which God can be approached. Cloud of unknowing, fairly vague, poetic language used there. But what he means is cloud, this idea of maybe even a veil, like something there that you just don't really know about. So you're entering into this cloud of unknowing. Why? Because you can't use your senses or your reason. This links nicely into natural and revealed theology from the AS Christian thought topics, this idea of gaining knowledge of God through faith and revelation, which doesn't involve senses or reason. People who genuinely seek God should put away their need to have answers to everything, allowing God to speak to them, accepting that God will remain a mystery. So that's last part in that box. That's saying that you can't always find the answer. So you need to set aside this need for an answer, recognise that God will always remain a mystery, but let God reveal himself. Let God reveal himself where you can therefore gain knowledge about him that you otherwise would not know, but don't expect to have certain set answers and don't expect to be able to use your reason or your senses to work it out. That's it for Via Negativa. That's all that you have, because Via Negativa itself is just using negative terms to describe God. Why? Because it points beyond God, using language that doesn't restrict God. Positive language is misleading, and therefore God will always remain a mystery. And so using Via Negativa is the only way to really get an understanding of God, because this will help you enter the cloud of unknowing. That's it. That's the argument. Where we're going to move into the two boxes underneath, one is going to be for supporters, one is going to be for critics, and then that's it done. If you get a question in the exam specifically on Via Negativa, and this is where you made your big mistake and did your mock exams just before Easter, when you got, I think it was specified on symbols, every single paragraph and argument has to be linked to Via Negativa, even if you then compare it to another one. So if you want to bring if Via Negativa is the question and you want to bring in symbol, no paragraph should start with anything that isn't Via Negativa. You do Via Negativa, then you make the link. Never start a paragraph with a topic that is not mentioned in the question. So the supporters of Via Negativa. This topic is great for the names that you really struggle to spell. So the second one is Maimonides. Jewish thinker Maimonides, there he is, argues the best way to convey an accurate understanding of the nature of God is to explain what God is not. In this way, people can move close to what God is without limiting God in their limited human thoughts. You've got a bit of space, just leave yourself one or two lines, you'll see why in a second, before you add in Buddhists. So the Buddhist bit also goes in the same box, please. But if you can leave a bit of space between Maimonides and Buddhist, you'll see why. And so what Maimonides is arguing there is, by using negative language, you move closer to what God is. You don't limit God, because you're not saying this is what God is, but your negative language moves you closer, whilst recognising that we have limited understanding. Buddhists also use Via Negativa. Whilst they don't have a God-like being, they still use that language to talk about the nature of nirvana, the afterlife. They also use it to talk about the nature of the Buddha. These are notoriously difficult concepts to describe. So via negativa can convey the essence of the ultimate reality, which cannot be described except as a negation of things we know from the physical world. You have to know what the word negation means. Negation is meaning negative. So negation means negative, it's just the way that you articulate it into the sentence. So negation of things we know from the physical world, meaning separated from, in the negative, not part of it. And so they might drop that word into a question. You need to know if it says negation, it means negative, which chances are it means via negativa if it's obviously the philosophy exam. If you have any questions or problems, any part of this you do not understand, just let me know. All right. So the box to the side, well, you'll see it in a second. When we did it in lesson, I then presented you with this question: what am I? This was found in Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed. So where I asked you to leave a space between Maimonides and Buddhists and the Buddhism, I want you just to give maybe one or two examples from there and the book, because this is what Davies criticises. So Maimonides, this is part of Maimonides' argument. Maimonides says it is not an accident, it is not a mineral, it is not a plant growing in the earth, it is not a body whose parts are joined by nature, it is not a flat object like boards or doors, it is not a sphere, it's not pointed, it's not round nor equilateral, it is not solid. Maimonides argues that you should know perfectly well from the negative language use what it is. He says that it's quite easy to know what that is. When we did it in class for the first time, you had no idea whatsoever, and this is the point Brian Davies is going to argue. So all you need to make the point in the exam is just give one or two of them. So just say Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed describes this object as it is not sphere, it is not flat like boards, assuming that people will then know from the negative language what it is he's talking about. That's all you would need to do. So then in the box to the side, this is for the criticisms. Obviously the answer was a ship. We didn't get that. So Davies is the one that criticises this idea of via negativa, and specifically Maimonides' example. So this goes into the box to the side. Brian Davies, in an introduction to the philosophy of religion, really, really good book, I do recommend it, criticises Maimonides and his ship example. Only saying what something is not gives no indication of what it actually is. And if one can only say what God is not, one cannot understand him at all. His point being that you had no clue Maimonides was talking about a ship. You had no clue that that's what he was talking about. And so if you're using negative language to describe God, how is that going to bring someone close to the idea of what God actually is? He goes on to say, imagine there's something in my room. This is all Davies. Imagine there's something in my room, and suppose I reject every suggestion you make as to what is actually in there. Is it a bed? Is it a wardrobe? Is it a table? Is it a TV? You reject everything that someone says. It then brings you no closer to what is actually in the room. So from this he is saying that it's unreasonable. Are we all right? Yeah, good. And what he's saying is it's unreasonable to assume that the person arrives at a notion of a ship when equally they could be thinking of a wardrobe or a coffin. So from the descriptions that Maimonides gave, you could have been thinking of a wardrobe or a coffin, not a ship. His point being, it brings you no closer to the idea of God if you have no clue of God in the first place. There will be a little bit on the next slide to get into the same box if you can fit it in. So there's going to be a further point. The box should be big enough though. So the last bit on this slide, as I said, there's a couple of bullet points on the next slide just to finish this off. Davies concludes that Maimonides' method of arriving at the right answer is unlikely to lead people in the right direction at all. This is actually a very, very clever argument. What Davies is saying is that when you have no clue what someone's talking about in the first place, using negative language brings you no closer. Like you had no clue he was talking about a ship, so the negative language brought you no closer. If I'd said to you he's describing a ship using negative language, you'd have all gone, oh yeah, well it isn't a board. Oh yes, it isn't equilateral or whatever he used, whatever examples he said. You would say, oh yeah, I understand. But when you start with not knowing anything, negative language brings you no closer. So if you have no understanding of God at all, using negative language brings you no closer. Quite a wordy argument, but a very clever one at the same time. Within the same box, please, if you have space, you should do, the box is big enough. It's just to finish it off, the further problem with the apophatic way. So what I've just verbally said, I typed up as well, so it's there. Another objection can be made against Maimonides' assumption that someone will gain understanding via elimination. That means by taking things away, you'll then get to what it actually is. Because we need to know beforehand what the different possibilities are. So if I'd said to you, actually, this is a vehicle. Which vehicle am I? You might have worked out eventually, oh, it's a ship. But by not knowing anything at all, elimination doesn't work. This way we can know what we have left when the alternatives have been crossed off. Thus, via negativa might not work for someone who begins by knowing nothing about God. If you have no concept of God at all, I could be describing a dinosaur in negative terms for all you know. That's it for via negativa. Hence the line that separates it, the next bit. So the next bit we're going to go into is going to be analogy. So that's it for via negativa. So even if, as I've said, even if you get a question in the exam on via negativa, you need to make that your structure of your whole essay, linking other things for or against it. And I'll help you make the synoptic links as we go through. So, moving now into the cataphatic way, or via positiva. So it might say in your exam, critically it says the apophatic way, that's via negativa. If it says cataphatic way, that's then via positiva, and this is analogy. So the next section is analogy. Thin box is just for Freud's quote. Analogies, it is true, decide nothing, but they make one feel more at home. Comfort blanket time again. That's actually a really good quote. It's a good quote to start an essay. It's nice and short. Even if you remember just the first bit. Analogies, it is true, decide nothing. So it's a nice place to start an essay that you can then lead into. This is what Aquinas says. This is the people that might criticise it. Large box underneath is going to be for Aquinas. Aquinas is the main name in analogy. Some thinkers, most notably Aquinas, argue that we cannot say anything positive that is literally true of God, because ordinary human language automatically limits God, placing his attributes only within our experience and understanding. This is a link with via negativa. Both via negativa, Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius, and Aquinas both argue that positive language is not literally true. You cannot say anything positive that will not distort God, because we're using positive language, we are using our own human interpretation, and therefore human interpretation is limited, therefore limiting God. And so both Pseudo-Dionysius and Aquinas are arguing you need to use other language than positive language. Positive language is just language that says what God is. God is love, that's positive language. But rather than via negativa, Aquinas instead talks about this idea of via immensia, the way of eminence, to show that what we say and know of God is limited. So we should realise that God's love, for example, is eminent. Whilst human love is partial and flawed, God's love is the prime example of love. What this means is this, because it sounds tricky, but it really isn't. Eminence, or via immensia, eminence is what, for example, people call the Pope often. They often call him His Eminence. It means the highest form, the highest thing. It should be of great respect, even holy in some ways. And so what Aquinas is saying there is that we cannot limit God with our language. We must recognise that even when we talk of God's love, we have to talk about the eminence of God's love. The idea that it is the greatest possible love, the highest love achievable. And so a bit like Plato and the forms. The idea that everything we get, exactly, that everything comes from the forms and they are the prime example. The only way to make positive claims about God is by recognising they are analogy or analogical rather than literal. So when talking of God in positive terms, it's by comparison, not by saying this is actually God. So when you say God is love, you aren't saying God is literally love, you are saying it as an analogy. The next slide will help explain that. If people speak about God listening to them, they don't literally mean God has ears that listens to them and hears them. They mean it as an analogy. You compare how God listens to how you listen to me, for example. You listen using your ears and you're using it as an analogy to say this is how God hears me, as an analogy. You're doing really well. I know this is quite dull for a Friday afternoon. Dull, but a good one in the exam if you can get it right. But we'll come back to that in a sec. Second box, last one on this side. It is important to understand the distinction between univocal and equivocal language. Univocal, uni, one. Same word, same meaning. The bath mat, a doormat. Mat is used in exactly the same way. Rome is a city, London is a city. Used exactly in the same way. Univocal means same word, same meaning. Equivocal, on the other hand, same word, totally different meaning. A computer mouse and a field mouse. If I say I have a computer mouse, you wouldn't suddenly think of a little mouse running around in a field on my desk. No, you know that I'm using the word mouse equivocally. It's the same word, but it has a different meaning. Hence why learning English is often a very difficult language, because we often have the same word to mean very different things. Analogy falls in between both of these. It's the middle ground. Aquinas rejected both univocal and equivocal language, believing that this analogy is the middle ground. Why? Because univocal, same word, same way. Equivocal, same word, completely different way. Whereas analogy is saying it's the same word that's comparatively similar. So there is a similarity. They're not completely different, but they're also not the same. They are similar. So analogical language, the same term is used in a similar or related way. So for example, the smooth floor and smooth wine. If I describe to you a smooth floor, you might think of laminate or polished wood. You know it's smooth. You understand the idea of smooth. I then say smooth wine, you don't think of laminate flooring. You would think of wine that is easy to drink, that the taste is clear and crisp, etc. And so you would think of it as smooth. They possess the same qualities of smoothness, but you're using it in a different way. Similar, but still different. Brian Davies also adds in, the bread is good, the baker is good. You don't think the baker is tasty and light and fluffy, but you're still using the term good, but they are still similar. And you can use that as an example of attribution. You attribute the good bread to the baker, which is where we're going in the next slide. So once again, univocal, same word, same meaning. Equivocal, same word, totally different meaning. Analogy, same word, similar meaning.
Can Aquinas come up with this?
No, univocal, equivocal is just English language. He didn't come up with it because analogy is always, even Plato's analogy, this idea has always been around, but he's the one that we link the philosophical elements of language to. So he won't be the only one, but he's the one that we learn. Right. Top of the next side, you have the boxes and the boxes. So you have analogy of attribution, analogy of proportion, and then this is where we're going to go. Analogy of attribution. There is a causal relationship between two things being described. What does causal mean? Sorry, Kyle? One thing causes another. So what would you often call that in an argument? Cause and effect. Excellent, Kyle. Spot on. That's exactly what it is. So a causal relationship is one thing leads to another, or cause and effect. That's exactly what this is talking about. A jumper might be called warm and cosy because the effect it has on the person. So we're talking about cause. The cause is the jumper being warm and cosy, and the effect is, it makes me feel all warm and cosy inside. Okay, so you attribute the feelings of warm and cosy with your jumper. You attribute how you feel to the jumper. Aquinas used the example of the bull. Very informative. The bull's urine. The bull's urine is healthy because it is caused by and attributed to the health of the bull. So the bull is healthy, and therefore you can attribute healthy urine to it. The cause is the bull is healthy, the effect is its urine's healthy as well. And there's the bull just to paint the picture. That looks like a healthy bull. Aquinas makes this distinction between God being good, wise, and loving in his essence. He says God does not only display love, but is the cause of all love. Whereas everything else is good or wise or loving because it participates in the essence of God. Again, Plato's forms, we have goodness because everything participates in the form of the good. Exactly the same idea. But we experience good, wise, loving because we attribute it to God. We have these things because of God. So the bull has healthy urine because the bull is healthy. You feel warm and cosy because your jumper's warm and cosy. We have these things because we attribute them to God. And so what it's talking about here is the analogy is our goodness, our wise, our loving is attributed, is similar to, but not exactly the same as when describing God as good, wise and loving. Similar, but not the same, but you can attribute ours to God. This is why this topic is quite a tough one to do in the exam. If you get it, you will do very, very well. If you get it wrong, you will full out belly flop in the exam. You have to make sure that if this is a topic you're going to do, you know the different types of analogy, that you know how to use examples to explain the meaning and then evaluate. It is not easy, isn't this? Because it's not something like Mary David that you can really get your teeth stuck into. Leona?
Is it basically saying that because God has goodness and that's why
Yeah.
He's loving, that we've got goodness?
Yes, and so we can attribute what we experience to God, and so when we use the words, they are used in an analogical sense in that they are similar but not quite the same as God, but we only have them because of God. Yeah. Analogy of proportion, on the other hand, words relate to objects that are different in proportion. So you have a fast cat and a fast car. The words are used in proportion to the object it relates to. So I might say, my cat is fast compared to other cats. Or I might say, oh, my Suzuki is faster than your Fiat, or whatever it might be. But if I started saying, well, my Fiat's faster than my cat, well, they're not in proportion to each other. So it's about comparing similar things in proportion to understand the use of the word. And so just as the cat is fast in relation to other cats, just as the car is fast in comparison with other cars, but comparing them together isn't in proportion. And so when linking it to God, Aquinas thought that we can describe God with terms such as loving and faithful, but you must recognise that God is infinitely vaster. So we might say, oh, George is loving, Susie is faithful, just like God. God is also loving and faithful, but we've got to recognise that comparing humans to God is like comparing a Fiat to a Ferrari. They're totally different proportions. And so in this sense, it's saying that we can recognise God's attributes as an analogy because they're similar to ours, but God is far beyond proportion to us. We discuss things in proportion to our human existence. God is beyond that in God's proportions, but you can still draw similarities. You're doing very, very well, everyone. Box underneath is for Ian Ramsey. Now, you do again need to know this. This isn't pass-fail minimum, but I do think you need to know it in order to be able to plump out an answer in an essay. So Ian Ramsey's models and qualifiers, quite straightforward, really. In his book, Religious Language, what an original name of a book. He talks about how we can use models when we speak of God. So speaking of God as righteous and loving, we understand this in reference point to our human experience. So he's talking about using our language as a reference point to talk of God. However, we also need qualifiers. Because we don't want to limit God with our limited language, we have to use qualifiers. Qualifiers are adjectives or adverbs such as perfectly or everlasting to also describe God. So it isn't that God is just loving, God is perfectly loving. Or everlasting love, not just this idea of a human concept. In this way, we anchor idea of God within our own experiences, then show how God is different proportionally, like your analogy of proportion, how God is similar but beyond. God isn't quite in proportion to us. So the qualifiers then help to point beyond. In a second, we're going to move on to the final criticism of analogy, and then we'll finish off with symbol. Symbol only has 3 boxes. Final box then for this section is just that little bit at the bottom, the further criticism. But in order to help you understand how it might be asked in the exam, that bubble there represents what sort of question you will be asked. Does Aquinas' views on analogy support effective expression of language about God? Yes or no? So obviously it wouldn't say yes or no in your exam, and it would probably say critically assess Aquinas' views, etc. But that's pretty much it. Does analogy work or not? And then you would bring in via negativa and symbol if you want to say whether the cataphatic way is the best approach in effective expression about God. And so that's how you would do it. And so if it's specifically on analogy, every paragraph starts with analogy. You've got your different sections you can talk about, and then you would link it to another area to show whether it does or doesn't work or is or isn't effective. So the last point is the further criticism, speaking of God using analogy, is unhelpful because we have to translate analogies into univocal language before they mean anything. So basically, when talking about analogy, we still have to translate it back into something we understand. And so we have to know how God's love relates to our love in the first place in order to understand it. Therefore, this method of speaking about God still leaves us with an unclear picture. So if I say God is love as an analogy, you still have to think of what does my understanding of love mean. And therefore, you're still no clearer. The last section, as you can see again on your sheet, has the line to separate them. This is for symbol. Tillich is going to be the main name for symbol. So you've got Pseudo-Dionysius, Aquinas, and symbol. So, final section is also the cataphatic way. You have two via positivas, symbol and analogy. You have one via negativa. One apophatic, two cataphatic. So, the thin box is for the Dawkins quote. Again, you can paraphrase it if you wish. I certainly would absolutely never do what some of my American colleagues do and object to religious symbols being used, putting crosses up in the public square and things like that. I don't fret about it at all. I'm quite happy about that. That's quite nice for Dawkins. So he's arguing that he has no issue with religious symbols being publicly made. So even if you just write, I certainly would absolutely never, let's work it out, never, ... 3 dots, object to religious symbols being used, you can take out the American colleagues bit. So if you want to shorten my quotes any further and chop out sections, put 3 dots. This is what you do at degree level. 3 dots means that you've taken something out of the quote. Another tip, if you get into your exam, you can remember the beginning of a quote and the end of a quote, you can't remember the bit in the middle, put 3 dots. An examiner will know no difference whether you've actually forgotten it or you've just shortened it because you need to shorten it. So put 3 dots. That shows that there's part of the quote missing. Paul Tillich, slide 1. So this is the first of the 2 boxes. He's a German-American Christian existentialist who fled Nazi Germany after losing his job as a professor of theology. Paul Tillich we come across in Moral Principles. He talks about the different types of love and agape. I don't think we come across Tillich again. Might be wrong though. It does pop up with anything to do with symbols. He is best known for his theology of correlation. Correlation meaning finding a relationship between 2 things. So what's the correlation between? On the one hand, questions that are raised by subjects like history, the arts, psychology, and the answers that are found in theology. So the correlation is between the questions being asked and the answers that theology can give. And so this was his aim, to show the relationship between faith and culture. All of our most important ideas, concerns, feelings, and experiences are expressed through symbol. These symbols only work though within a particular time, place and culture, often losing their power and significance when society changes. So they're fluid. Symbols are not set in stone. Symbols change, adapt, develop. Think about the Nazi swastika, that used to be a Hindu symbol of peace. So symbols change, depends on how they are used. Think about things like hand gestures. You often have symbols to show hand gestures. So feelings, if you're okay, you put your thumbs up. If you're not okay, you put your thumbs down. So these show how you are feeling through symbol. So if I didn't add the words to it, I just stuck my thumb up, you'd know I was asking you, are you okay? Or I'd go like that, okay. So symbols don't just have to be an image. They can be physical as well. Like Aquinas, Tillich believed that ordinary human language is inadequate to convey ultimate truths about God, adding that literal language of God is unhelpful, often giving a false impression of the nature of God. And so Aquinas, as does Tillich, they both recognise that our human language is inadequate. Obviously, Pseudo-Dionysius says that we have to accept the mystery of God. So all are recognising that we are limited and that we have to use our language, which is limited, to point beyond this to God. Therefore, all religious language is symbolic. Not analogy, not negative, symbolic. Not literal. Literal meaning exactly the truth. And cannot be subjected to tests in order to assess its meaningfulness. You can't test symbol.
I might confuse matters, but do you know sign language?
Yeah.
Would that be symbol or would that be like language? Or is that just completely irrelevant?
But it's a language, but it's sign language.
Yeah, but I'm more thinking of the word sign, because on the next slide Tillich makes a distinction between symbols and signs, but signs are things that have just been randomly attributed to it. But I think that sign language actually has meanings, and if it's meaning and it's participating in it, I would say it is symbols. So things like that, the hello, it's kind of, it is a symbol too. Yeah, I would say it's potentially symbols, but then because it uses the word sign, I'd maybe bring it in to actually discuss the difficulty between knowing the difference.
Ordinary human language though, so because it's representing.
But it's represented, so it is a symbol,
Yeah.
and it participates.
Yeah.
Final slide, and then we can bring that idea in. Symbols open up levels of reality which are otherwise closed. It's a really nice quote again. Symbols just open up a reality otherwise that we would not be able to access. So otherwise closed to us. Symbols take us beyond the world available to senses, understandable and accessible to all, point beyond themselves towards an ultimate reality. Includes visual images, rituals, saints, stories, ideas. So the Virgin Mary is a symbol of the Catholic Church, or a symbol of virginity. Rituals, like kneeling in front of a cross, you are showing respect. That's a symbol of your respect and love for Christ. So they point beyond themselves, but they are understandable and accessible to all. There was something as a YouTube video that popped up the other day on my feed, which is basically how to speak as loads of languages, and it's basically using symbols. So if you go like that, anybody in any language will know you're cold. They would understand that. Or if you do a symbol to your mouth to look like, they'll understand you need food. And so there's certain symbols that you can do as far as your body language, which isn't an image. It's the way your body language is that shows the symbol of what you mean, which is why I do think sign language, you are using your body as part of communicating a message that goes beyond. So I would say it is. But this is where the confusion then comes in. He made the distinction between signs and symbols. Signs are just arbitrarily random choices that stand for something else, but don't really matter what form the sign takes as long as people know what it means. It doesn't really matter what the sign is as long as people know what it means. Whereas symbols, the final point, symbols participate in what they represent. So Tillich uses the example of a national flag. This represents national pride. It evokes feelings of loyalty and patriotism, as well as being part of national pride, like being used in soldiers' funerals. So a symbol not only represents something, it also participates in what it represents. Like the crucifix represents Christ dying for everybody, it's also carried in things like Good Friday ceremonies. So it has meaning, it participates, it points beyond itself. But you know, whether you go to Australia, China. If you see a cross, you know that's a church. That's Christianity. Are there any questions?